Hello listeners and welcome to Plugged In, the Energy News podcast from Montel, where we bring you the latest news, issues and changes happening in the energy sector. Will April's blackout accelerate cooperation for more interconnectors between Spain and France? That's certainly what the governments in Iberia are pushing for. A Spanish energy ministry sources confirmed last week that Spain and Portugal would send joint letters to the EU Energy Commissioner and French Energy Minister, urging them to promote the delivery of the current plans for power links. But is there resistance from Paris to create more connections with its southern neighbours? Large infrastructure projects are never popular amongst local populations. They are costly, but more importantly, could power interconnectors with Spain lower wholesale prices in France? That's what we'll be exploring in this week's episode. I'll be speaking to Spanish and French energy experts later on. But first, I'm pleased to be joined by two of our Montel journalists, our Spain correspondent, Belen Belmonte. A warm welcome to you, Belen.
Thank you, Richard.
And our reporter in France, Muriel Boselli. A warm welcome to you too, Muriel.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Belen, I'd like to start by asking you a couple of questions. Why is Spain pushing for the construction of the planned cables with France? Why is that so important?
So right now, Spain has 2.8 gigawatts of power interconnection with France, and another link is under construction, which is expected to come online in 2028. And it will increase the transmission capacity to 5 gigawatts. In addition to these cables, there are two further interconnections projects proposed through the Pyrenees, which would raise the interconnection capacity up to 8 gigawatts. However, even if all these projects were completed, Spain would still not meet the European interconnection target of 10% set for 2020. And of course, it won't meet the 15% goal for 2030. For Spain, it's very important for all these cables to go ahead. Firstly, to increase security of supply and to further integrate the country's electricity market with the rest of the European power market, but also to help keep expanding renewables. So without more interconnection, all that clean and cheaper generation that is expected to grow in the coming years would remain trapped in Spain and Portugal. And this is already a concern for Iberian renewables investors who already face low prices due to this excess supply, but also for the European Commission, which wants all of Europe to benefit from affordable renewable energy.
Excellent. And then would it have made any difference had Spain had more connections with France during the blackout? Would it have prevented the blackout that we saw on the 28th of April?
Well, this was actually one of the first things debated after the blackout. Europe has 3 gigawatts of frequency containment reserves, which are designed to absorb sudden grid imbalances across the continent. And in theory, this could have helped. However, the problem was that Spain lost access to these reserves after the interconnection with France was automatically disconnected as a safety measure. So, according to analysts, having more interconnection wouldn't have stopped the blackout. But what they do point out is that with greater transmission capacity, the restoration of electricity supply will have been faster.
Absolutely. Those are important points. Thank you, Belen. Muriel, if I can turn to the view from France here, what's the French government's position on more interconnection with Spain?
Well, France officially says it supports the development of interconnections, whether with Spain or the UK or Germany. But it also says that investment and operational costs should be shared fairly between countries. This is because France, if you look at it on the map, it's right at the center of Europe. So it carries a lot of power just for transmission. And this is really quite costly for maintenance reasons, notably. So the position of our French government is that it basically France should receive some kind of financial support. So it could take the shape of a European cost-sharing mechanism through a tax or levy redistributed according to. Okay, so there are two levels. On one hand they say yes, on the other hand they're saying yes, but.
Absolutely, Bjorn. But what is the view amongst the power industry? Because there's also potentially is there a fear that more interconnection with Spain could reduce prices?
Yeah, well, if you remember 2022, Richard, France would have really, really loved to have some more interconnection with Spain, but things have changed tremendously since then, and prices have gone down. So more interconnections would mean cheaper power coming into France, and so that could be, in effect, good for consumers, but not so good for French power producers because they are producing power at a more expensive rate. And also, I mean, we also have this thing in France because we are so focused on nuclear power. 70% of our power is produced with nuclear reactors. It might mean more power from Spain might mean that nuclear may struggle to remain economically viable. We already have quite a big debate in France about what we call modulation, which basically means that we change the output of nuclear reactors according to the amount of demand and the amount of renewables at one point, the amount of renewables which are there at one point. This means too much modulation, some say, could be bad for reactors. So we could have a similar situation with more output coming from Spain. So yeah, so not so good, not so good for France, basically, to have more power from Spain. Basically, France has been going very slow on the current Bay of Biscay interconnector, which is now due for 2028. And it's not committing for the two others. We still have no FID for the projects.
Muriel, thank you very much. That's the view from Paris. Thank you. So, who will benefit more from further interconnections between France and Spain? To explore what this would mean for Spain, I'm pleased to be joined by Ana Barillas, Managing Director of Iberia and LATAM at Aurora Energy Research. A warm welcome to you, Ana, and it's great to have you back on the pod.
Many thanks, Richard. It's great to be here.
So France has strong interconnections with Germany, Italy and Switzerland, for example, to the north of Spain. But why not Spain? What's the history here between connecting these two markets? Why is there not more?
Yeah, I mean, I think the geography, the Pyrenees mountain range makes it particularly difficult, I think, to interconnect the Iberian Peninsula to France. I think that's part of it. Building interconnectors more broadly is always a bit of a contentious issue in terms of who bears the cost of such interconnectors. And obviously, the Iberian Peninsula is kind of to an end of Europe, right? So it is really a bilateral negotiation in many ways between kind of Spain and France to get it done. As you know, the level of interconnection of the Iberian Peninsula as a whole is about 5%, really, if you look at it like the installed capacity as the base for the calculation. But Spain is much lower than that, is about kind of 2.5%, which clearly compared to France, which is over the 15% target that the EU has set, it's a big difference in terms of how interconnected it is. And the debate will continue in terms of additional interconnections over the next few years.
Absolutely. I mean, there have been plans over going back several decades, so it seems to be often delayed. But we've heard the Spanish energy minister say that interconnectors between Spain and France are a Europe-wide issue. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the concept behind a more interconnected Europe has always been one focus on the best utilization of resources across Europe, right? So, you have regions that have an abundance of kind of wind and solar, and, Spain and Portugal are obviously here, and hydro as well. You have, France, and, who can provide a lot of base load energy. And the logic is fairly simple, right? The more interconnections you have, the more diversity of generation resources that you have, the less you're exposed to kind of local events in the different markets. So it is very much a maximizing the utilization of resources across a very varied kind of continent in terms of the availability of natural resources. And obviously the resiliency point as well, right? Like, you are less exposed to individual issues in each country if you have big interconnections. So yeah, that's always been the logic. You avoid curtailment. There's from these two things, you get a lot of kind of quantifiable kind of benefits. Of course, in the case of Spain, unfortunately, being interconnected to the rest of Europe means being interconnected with France. Right, and this is where it becomes a bit of a political debate when it comes to France and Spain, Iberia more broadly.
Absolutely. I think, in the Nordic region, certainly cables, and even in Germany as well, the power links between countries is a bit of a political hot potato. People say it would increase prices in some areas and lower in others. What's the situation in France and Spain? I mean, is there a case for saying, okay, France would see lower power prices as a result of a more interconnection, whereas Spain would see an increase? Or is that, again, too simplistic, Anna?
I mean, I think it is simplistic, but it's also not necessarily a bad way of seeing it, right? So the reality is, what interconnections do is it allows power to flow from areas where you have an abundance of it, which is at the moment Iberia during solar hours, to areas where you may not have the same amount of resources, or the same amount of excellence of resources at that time. So the expectation would be that you would have a lot of flows from kind of Spain into France, at least everything else equal, in those solar hours, were you to have more interconnection. On the other hand, it is slightly simplistic in the sense that power flows depend very much on the structure of bits in a power market. And there have been studies done, actually, which I think it's really interesting, that basically say, what if kind of Europe was completely free of interconnection constraints, so a fully interconnected Europe. And so effectively what you have is an aggregation of demand, an aggregation of supply across all of the interconnected countries. And if you were to think about how the merit order looks in that case, so, kind of the order of the bits of different kind of plants, what you see actually is that solar in Spain, because it's not incentivized to bid deeply negative, would actually not be the main kind of cause for depressing prices or negative prices in France, for example. In fact, there would be some hours where solar in Spain doesn't even dispatch, because what you have dispatching first is all of those deeply negative bids from solar, from plants that are getting subsidies, for example, the European countries. And so, to say that, kind of what you would get with more interconnections from Spain into France is more negative prices, for example. The reality is that the bigger cost of negative prices is interconnections from other places into France, if you want to extrapolate that to, the logical conclusion, I guess.
I mean, I think that's a very important point, Anna, because we're not just talking about a two-way interconnection. It's the whole copper plate across Europe, the whole interconnectedness, and that's a very important point. I think the devil is always in the detail there. But so I think, and that's an important argument for more interconnection. But why has it taken so long, and why have there been so many delays and postponements in getting those kind of power links between France and Spain? It's not just the topography, is it? Or are there other regions?
The topography doesn't help. I mean, I think that's a reality. So, the next interconnection that's expected to be built, the Bay of Biscay interconnection, did suffer some delays because of kind of planning effectively, right? But it does go beyond that, right? Again, it goes back to the mismatch of incentives between, kind of what Spain would gain from more interconnections and what France would gain from more interconnections. Now, I think the argument from France is very much that they wouldn't benefit as much as Spain would benefit, and therefore they wouldn't want to pay, a proportional amount even, if that's the case. And that is due to the way that consumer tariffs are structured in France, but also the fact that, you have all of this nuclear kind of energy already there. And if anything, there's an excess amount of generation in France compared to demand, right? So I think it is strictly speaking true to say that the immediate benefit would be probably more to the Spain side than the France side. But I also think it's a bit short-sighted to think about it this way, because when nuclear was down in France in 22, 23, the reality is that without the little interconnection and all of the flows from Spain into France, and that was just solar, it was also CCGT capacity flowing into France. France would have had a lot more trouble kind of managing that nuclear decrease, right? So I think over time, it is very much a resilience and a security of supply issue, even if immediately the benefits may not be as obvious.
Absolutely. I think, and then that's an important point as well in terms of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of climate change, maybe potentially more drought, which does affect the nuclear production in France, but will boost solar output in Spain. So that's where neighbours come to each other's help.
Exactly. And that's precisely the logic of increasing interconnection capacity, right? Is removing kind of the very localized risks that you would have if every country in Europe was an island, an energy island, and diversify some of those risks a bit more broadly.
There is a suspicion as well, Anna, that in France there is resistance to increased interconnection because it would lower prices that the producers there would receive. Do you think that's a valid argument?
Listen, economically, it has to be, right? Like, if you remove the constraints between an area where prices are fundamentally lower and allow some of that energy to flow into a price region when prices are fundamentally higher, then yes, what you would expect is the prices in the region where they were originally lower to go up, and the prices in the region where they were originally higher to go down. So I don't think you can argue against that. I think what then kind of happens and why this is slightly more complicated is because it is not just about the energy flows in a day-ahead market, right? It's about how that translates into benefits for consumers, obviously profitability for the nuclear plants, but to some extent as well, it may change the requirements for ancillary services in France, for example, right? And that has a cost that needs to be analyzed as well.
And I mean, I think one of maybe we don't know what the results of the investigation, the probe into the blackout are going to be, although we have some ideas about some of the details that caused it. But what do you think there'll be an increased urgency for more power links between Spain and France going forward?
I mean, I think there'll be a lot of pressure on pushing some of that kind of forward. So yes, again, it's integrating renewables into the system requires a number of different things that you probably didn't need to think about as hard before. There's a lot being said about kind of inertia and kind of synchronous compensators, grid forming inverters. But again, interconnections allow kind of some of these existing inertia, for example, from all of the nuclear in France to support the Iberian system. So yes, I mean, I think it's potentially it's one of many other measures that can be taken. Probably one that would take longer to implement, if I'm honest, partly because of the technical requirements and partly because of the political environment that we've been discussing. But yes, I think it does highlight one of the benefits of interconnections, and therefore there will probably be a bit more pressure on it.
But it's not going to happen overnight. As
it won't,
say.
Right?
No,
it absolutely won't.
But it certainly will increase the urgency. Anna, thank you very much for being a guest on Plugged In, the Montel News podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Richard.
So, what's the view from France? Do French energy producers and the government agree that it's mutually beneficial to have more power links? I'm pleased to be joined by Emeric de Vigan, Managing Director, 42 Advisors. Great to have you back on the pod. A warm welcome to you, Emeric.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you.
Let's talk about this, the issue of interconnectors. So from the French perspective, why has there been such a delay, or why have there not been as many interconnectors between Spain and France as in other parts of the country?
Generally, it just takes forever to get all the agreements or green lights to build an interconnector. There's a lot of people who are generally not very happy to see a new high voltage line, passing nearby where they live. So I'd say that's one of the explanation. The second explanation is that it's not cheap. It definitely isn't free to build an interconnection. So you need to find the financing and find the right business model, business case to build the interconnection. If you build too much interconnector, then there is pretty much no more value left in the interconnector because there isn't any price spread left.
And how about, concerns maybe from French energy producers and also from the government and regulators that if there is a lot more if there are a lot more imports of cheaper, say, Spanish renewable energy coming in, does that undermine the price of French nuclear energy?
Yeah, I mean, technically it can, but looking at the global picture, France has benefited a lot from interconnection in the last few decades, and I think we should be careful in not giving too much importance in recent events. I'm not saying we shouldn't care about what happened, of course, but generally speaking, France is a pretty well positioned country in terms of interconnections. In the grand scheme of things, France is exporting a lot of nuclear power through interconnectors, and that's pretty positive for the trade balance of the country. So yes, Spain can be a bit different because we would be importing very low prices, but I wouldn't say that's the main reason for not building more interconnection. If anything, the difficulty with interconnection is that it tends to harmonize the power prices between countries with very different energy policies, if you want. So sometimes it's hiding things that shouldn't be hidden, if you want.
Okay. Could you explain that, Emeric?
Don't get me wrong. I think interconnectors are really good. For example, historically, I think it was very smart to export baseload power to Switzerland and import peak load power to Switzerland. That they were able to produce thanks to their specific geography. With a lot of hydro reservoirs and so on. Now the question is, does it make sense to build so much reliance between different countries, where one country tends to produce a lot of excess surplus of energy, if you want, and has to export it to another countries to avoid expensive curtailment or potential blackouts, or in the other direction, does it make sense to see a country relying on its neighbor to find enough supply in terms of spikes, of demand spike, in the winter, for example. And that's the case for France. France has been shutting down most of its peak generation in the last few years, across the last 10 or 15 years. And what happened, I don't know if it can happen anymore, but what happened is that most of this, peak generation was imported from Germany in the winter. And it was the case in 2022, actually, also, when the nuclear had massive issues.
So, I mean, yeah, of course, it works both ways here, Emeric. And neighbors help out in times of crisis, like in 2022. Wouldn't French industry welcome an influx of lower, greener Spanish energy, for example, if that would bring prices down?
Yes, and you pointing in the direction of the real problem is that generators and consumers usually don't have the same goals. Producers want a very high price, and consumers, they want a low price. And at a country level, so let's talk about France because we're here to discuss France. The more we export, the higher the wholesale prices go, which isn't great for the consumer. So it could be that the consumers would very much prefer to export less or only import cheap power from Spain. But then you would end up with too low prices, and you would see generators, producers struggling, not being able to make any money to cover their costs. So this is why, I mentioned earlier that, it's important to have a harmonized policy, or at least well-thought policy, if you want, because ultimately we need to find an equilibrium prices where both producers and consumers are happy or can survive, where a low enough price for industrial companies, high enough price for generators.
And that's the crux of the issue here, isn't it? And it can get very, very political. Can you imagine if the tables were turned, Emeric, and France experienced the type of blackout we saw in Spain? Do you think there would be more of a push for more power links with its neighbors?
I don't know. It really depends on where the blackout comes from. Only 3 years ago we were concerned about potential blackouts because we thought we would be. We wouldn't have enough power. Now we're thinking about blackouts because we would have too much power. Could there be a blackout in France coming from domestic issues? Yes. I mean, you never know. You can have a massive trips at large units. You can have cyber attacks, whatever is possible. So if that happens, would we like to have more interconnections? Maybe, I'm not so sure. If the blackout is imported from another countries, then it would be a firm no-go for any more interconnections. So I'm not seeing a lot of very clear elements in favor of a significant amount of new interconnections, to be honest. And even if nuclear was to face a similar crisis to the one in 2022 with the stress corrosion, I feel that politicians would just ask for more peak units, even if they were to be in reserve. Like most old and unable to reconnect to the grid in case of emergency.
I mean, that's very interesting. France would prefer highly polluting maybe peakers than getting some greener energy from its neighbors. Is that what you were saying, Emeric?
It seems to me that the public opinion in France would prefer this solution. Honestly, it's not completely wrong because this peak energy is not really green when it's imported into France. When France needs to import power from its neighbors, it's very often in a very non-windy, very cold weather situation, where you have a lot of coal and gas power stations running across Europe.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's that's not always the case. We can't sort of pretend that all imports into France are green and clean. But for example, I mean, this is a hypothetical situation again, Emeric, but a number of years now, over the past 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen problems in the summers in France, with those very hot summers, the river temperature is very high, which curtails some of the nuclear production. If this happens in the summer months, it's also a time of peak solar generation. Wouldn't this be, a way that Spain could come to the aid of France?
Yes. But then, in the summer, the demand is so much lower than in the winter that I would say that we have enough interconnection already. I'm not sure we do need a lot more. Because, also when you look at the flows on the interconnectors, they don't always happen at a very high price differential, at a very high price spread. So does it make really sense to build an interconnection to export power with no spread? I'm not so sure, because I don't know if, especially in a situation where the security of supply is not really at. I think we tend to overdo the summer constraints. Yes, there are constraints on nuclear power station. There's been constraints. I think it initially started in 2003. Significant price spikes in the summer. Since then, EDF has changed their maintenance schedules, where most of the seaside nuclear stations are made available in the summer to try and avoid that. So I'm really not too concerned about cooling constraints, especially as we have a lot of solar.
Yeah, as well.
Also in France.
Absolutely.
Domestic solar.
Yeah, it's quite sunny in France as well. Let's not forget that. Very true, Emeric. So what do you think will happen here in terms of, there's a interconnector due to come online 2027, 28, if I'm not mistaken. Do you think that there could be some urgency to get that online before that date?
It seems to me that the Spanish government is blaming the blackout on France and on not enough interconnectors. Is it really feasible? I'm really not sure. And does it really make sense to push for more interconnection? I'm not sure either. Personally, not against the fact that a portion of the security of supply relies on other countries, surrounding countries, like trying to, import megawatts during peak hours, for example. I don't think, any country should have to rely on its neighbors for grid stability.
Yeah, I think that's clear. We don't really know what the reasons were for the blackout. I think we have to wait for some of the investigations and what happens there. And if there is a push for more interconnections, seems to be, like you're saying, relying on enables for that type of inertia that's required, or that kind of a grid stability or resilience is maybe a step too far. But do you think then, would you be, I can hear a strong case, Emeric, that there is unlikely to be a new interconnection or new power links between Spain and France after the one that's coming online in 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, that's my view. Seen from now. That's my view seen from now. Yeah.
Yeah, and you think that would be the view of the French government and policymakers as well?
Yeah, because I don't think that's the most urgent investment. There's plenty of other things to look at for the French government. In terms of energy, I'm looking only.
Yeah, absolutely. There's other priorities and other things that infrastructure that's being planned to be built before then. Emeric, thank you very much for being a guest on Plugged In, the Energy News podcast. Always great to have you on.
Thank you.